Your junk car is dragging down the whole neighborhood, Sergeant Randall snarled, sneering into the window, spit flying with every word. Beside him, Officer Troy had already gripped his taser, ready to strike. They rummaged through the vehicle, snatched documents, and tore apart a veteran ID card. The black man said not a word, but exactly 1 hour later, a black SUV pulled up, and a 4-star general stepped out. He was the son of the man they had just humiliated. The moment he shattered the window was the moment he shattered his career. Where you live, does something like this happen often? It was a still, dry afternoon when the battered silver truck rolled to a halt along the side of the cracked asphalt road. Rust bloomed like a spreading infection along the doors and fenders, and the muffler coughed once before falling silent. Behind the wheel, an elderly black man sat motionless for a moment. His left hand shielded his eyes from the descending sun, while his right rested atop a worn steering wheel. The leather peeled back in faded strips like the rings of a tired tree. The engine ticked faintly, releasing heat and weariness in slow pulses, like the sigh of something long past its prime. He didn't shift, didn't reach for the keys, just sat there in the silence, as if measuring the stillness. Then, as if summoned by the quiet, 2 white police cruisers swung into frame like twin blades. They moved with the kind of confidence that wasn't rushed, just routine. The sirens stayed off. There was no need for noise. Their presence alone announced the power shift. Their doors opened with the hollow thunk of entitlement, and the officers stepped out, not with caution but with certainty. They approached the truck like it was a stain on clean pavement, something uninvited, something temporary. One officer rapped his knuckles against the window, hard and fast, like knocking on a pawn shop counter. "Roll it down," he snapped. There was no greeting, no question, just the cold, flat tone of someone who was used to being obeyed. The old man didn't flinch. He pressed the button slowly, lowering the window. As the glass descended, the air seemed to change. Not cooler, not warmer, just heavier, thicker. One officer leaned into the opening like he was peering into a fishbowl. "You stopping here drops the property value of the whole damn block," he said, voice hoarse and greasy, like a bad joke swallowed halfway down. It wasn't a threat. It was an assertion, an insult handed out like a traffic ticket. The other officer's eyes dropped to the dashboard and locked on the hat lying there, faded olive green, dust clinging to the brim with the words military stitched across the front in worn silver thread. The fabric was threadbare, the letters nearly ghosted, but they held the weight of history. The officer's smirk spread slowly. His eyes narrowed. "Cute," he muttered. The tone was acidic, sarcastic, the kind that didn't need to be loud to cut. It didn't matter if the hat was real. What mattered was that he didn't believe it deserved to be here. Then, without asking, he stepped back and slapped the truck's side with an open palm. The sound was flat and deliberate. "This whole thing's expired," he said. "The ride, the driver, both out of circulation." The old man's hands remained steady on the wheel. His shoulders didn't rise. His mouth stayed closed, but his eyes shifted, just slightly. Just enough to register the insult. Not surprised, not angry, just tired of the cycle. Without a word, the second officer broke off and circled to the rear. The click of a phone camera followed. Once, then again. "Got the plate," he said, voice casual. "Might send it to the neighborhood group chat." There was no attempt to hide the derision. As he returned, the old man's gaze darkened. Not rage, something deeper. Something rooted. His eyes hardened like cooling steel, but his lips didn't part. He didn't ask questions, didn't plead, he just watched. The officers exchanged a look. One of those quick, silent conversations built from arrogance and routine. "Look at him," the first muttered. "These types always know the drill. Silence means guilty. Silence means hiding something." The second nodded, stepping closer. "You think if you sit real still we'll just go away?" he asked, voice quieter but sharper. "Think that hat gives you a pass?" Still nothing. No blink. No shift. Just breathe, slow and deliberate. "You think you're better than us?" the first one asked, tone dropping into something uglier, more personal. He leaned in closer, eyes locked. "That it?" he hissed. "You think you're some kind of goddamn hero?" The man blinked once. Nothing more. "I've seen this look before," the second officer muttered. Too proud to speak, too guilty to defend, he clicked his tongue, mock disappointment bleeding through. "You'd think a man with a military cap would know how to answer a direct order. You think that dusty piece of cloth means something?" the first sneered, glancing again at the hat. "Out here, we write the rules, and you just parked in the middle of them." Still, the old man stayed silent. The only sound from him was the faint whistle of breath through his nose. Measured, practiced, like someone who knew exactly how long to hold their peace. The officer who'd taken the pictures shook his head. "Bet he can't even remember where he got that cap. Probably stole it from a thrift store." He leaned down, face close to the window, and tapped it twice. "Hey, old man, you hear me?" The man didn't flinch. That was when the first officer took a step back and ran his tongue over his teeth. "Maybe we should check the vehicle," he said. "Make sure it's not stolen. Guy looks like he's about 102. Might have driven it here from a nursing home." The other officer laughed again, the kind of laugh that was meant to leave bruises. They stepped back for a moment, the air between them heavy with something worse than threat. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing you won't be held accountable. The kind of certainty that's more dangerous than a weapon. And yet, through all of it, the old man didn't move. He didn't rise. He didn't yell. His presence wasn't small, wasn't broken. It was calm, centered, an island of stillness in a tide of hostility. One officer adjusted his belt, fingers brushing the handcuffs like a pianist checking his keys. "You ever wonder why people like this don't talk?" he asked. "It's because they're hiding something. You stay silent long enough, and eventually the truth shows up." The second officer grunted in agreement. Or maybe they just like playing the victim, like putting on old uniforms and pretending they matter. But none of their words landed where they wanted them to, not really, because they weren't speaking to him, they were speaking to him, and he refused to give them the response they craved. So they filled the silence themselves, with noise, with judgment, with cheap performances meant to flex power. And he let them, because he knew something they didn't. He knew that silence, when held by the right man, could be louder than a siren. The silence hung like the last breath of a storm not yet finished. The air still carried the weight of the words unspoken, the balance of power not tipped but taut, pulled so tight it could snap at any moment. The old man didn't speak, didn't blink. His fingers rested firm around the wheel, the cap on his lap like a memory caught in cloth. Then, with the slow arrogance of someone who believed he owned the very street they stood on, the officer with the sandy brown hair leaned through the window and plucked the cap from the dashboard. He twirled it between his fingers like it was nothing, like it wasn't soaked in years that bled and battles that burned. The faded silver stitching of U.S. military caught the last threads of sunlight, its dull sheen glinting like a scar not yet healed. "What's this?" he sneered, turning the cap upside down, then back again. "Looks like something left behind in a psych ward gift shop. Or did you win this in a cereal box, Grandpa?" His laughter erupted, sharp and sudden, cracking the air with cruel delight. "Tan Hut," he barked mockingly, snapping into a slouched parody of a military salute, one hand at his temple, the other still clutching the cap. His knees buckled as he performed a grotesque little bow, bending low like a clown at a traveling circus who'd forgotten whether he was supposed to be funny or feared. His partner burst into laughter, louder than before, a guttural snort meant not to entertain but to degrade. The phone came out again, the lens zeroing in on the scene like it was comedy gold. "You've got to see this," he chuckled, pressing the shutter. "Posting this to the precinct group. Instant classic." The old man inhaled slowly, the breath long and deep, like someone drawing strength from a place so far within it hadn't seen light in decades. His eyes closed, not to hide, not in shame, but to retreat, briefly, to a quieter place, where steel helmets clanged and sand stuck in boots, where orders came without malice and silence was survival, not provocation. He said nothing, but his lips tightened, pressed into a line not of fear but of restraint, the kind of silence that had kept him alive long before these boys had learned to walk. Bet he found it in a donation bin behind the nursing home. the partner said, voice bubbling with sick amusement. Probably snuck out during bingo night. They laughed again, proud of their audacity. One held the cap like a joke, the other like evidence of a lie. To them it was a stage prop, a tattered relic of a forgotten play. The honor it once held had no currency in this interaction. They weren't just mocking a man. They were mocking what made him a man. The years, the service, the silence. The old man opened his eyes, slowly, steadily, and reached forward. Not fast, not demanding, just deliberate. A hand extended, palm up, asking not for mercy but for recognition, for the return of something sacred. The cap hung suspended between them, for a breath, a heartbeat, a moment that could have given it back. The brown-haired officer smirked and flicked his wrist, letting the hat fall. It hit the ground with a quiet finality, landing in a shallow puddle of dirt and motor oil. Its brim darkened, soaking the filth like blood into the cloth. No one spoke. For half a second, not even the officers smiled. Then the one with the camera muttered, "Oops," and stepped back. The hat sat there like a corpse. The silence returned, but this time it was not heavy. It was radioactive. The old man didn't move to retrieve it. He didn't sigh. He didn't curse. He simply looked at it, eyes tracing the fraying seams, the soaked brim, the filth now staining the insignia, and he held his gaze like a blade. To the officers it was a victory, a small one, a petty one, but one thing they could feel. They had stripped a symbol bare, taken something once worn with pride, and turned it into trash. And they had done it in daylight, with laughter, without fear of consequence. The shame was not theirs. That, they assumed, belonged to him. But shame did not sit on his shoulders. It sat on theirs, unseen, unacknowledged, but inevitable, because the world had shifted just enough, just subtly, and though they couldn't feel it yet, the storm had already begun. The officer with the camera reviewed his pictures, thumb swiping through frames like he was skimming memes, not memories. "Gonna be a hit on the group chat," he chuckled, zooming in on the shot of his partner saluting like a fool. "Might make the weekend roundup." His partner leaned over to look, laughing through his nose, proud of the performance like it was an achievement, not an atrocity. They high-fived, half-hearted, casual, unthinking. The old man still hadn't moved. His hand remained where it had extended, now slowly retracting, not in defeat, but in dismissal. He didn't lower his head. He didn't retrieve the cap. His stillness was no longer passive. It was a protest in its purest, most dangerous form, a refusal to play their game. His presence, composed and untouched by their mockery, exposed their pettiness for what it was, and deep down they could feel it. They were throwing punches at a wall that would not crack. The silence wasn't hollow. It rang with everything they didn't understand, with every soldier buried without thanks. Every medal was left in a drawer, because the world didn't change. Every salute was never returned. The cap on the ground wasn't just fabric. It was fabric woven with silence, with fire, with loyalty spent like coin in places no one dared remember. But none of that mattered to the two of them. Their job was never about understanding. It was about control, about reminding people like him what place they now held, if any. "Don't think you're above us just 'cause you wore a uniform once," the brown-haired one snapped, voice sharper now, tinged with something unsettled. "You're not special. You're just out." The man didn't answer. His face was still, but his eyes were something else. They weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They knew. They were older than the officers' years combined. They were witnesses to things these boys wouldn't survive 10 minutes in, and in those eyes was judgment, not delivered with words or threats, but with the cold weight of history. The younger officer finally bent down, nudged the cap with the toe of his boot, and then looked up. "You want this?" he asked. "Pick it up." But the man didn't move. He simply stared. And it wasn't the silence of pride or protest or passive resistance. It was the silence of someone who had nothing left to prove, nothing left to fear, and absolutely no use for their games. That silence roared louder than any accusation. "Suit yourself," the officer said, backing away with a shrug. "Trash belongs with trash." And with that, they turned their backs, swaggering a few steps away, already preparing to leave the scene they thought they had owned. But behind them, that truck, that man, that cap, they lingered like smoke in a closed room. A symbol had been thrown to the ground, but the memory of what it represented stood tall, rooted and indestructible, and though they had mocked it and laughed at it and sullied it, they hadn't broken it. Because they couldn't. Because you can't kill what never needed your permission to live. One of the officers looked back, half curious, half irritated that the man hadn't bent. "You just gonna sit there all day?" he called out. "Thought you Army types were tough. Thought you were trained to take orders. But maybe you're just trained to obey the ones that let you hide." There was no reply, just the engine ticking in the heat, just the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the block, just the shadow of a man whose strength no longer needed sound. In their minds, they had humiliated him. They had performed dominance, recorded it, and shared it, but in truth, they had only revealed themselves. Their words were blades too dull to cut, their cruelty a scream into silence that swallowed it whole. And somewhere in that silence, something ancient stirred. Not rage, not revenge, but memory. Memory that did not decay with age. Memory that could not be erased by boots on hats or laughter in uniforms. The officers walked back to their cruisers, pride in their gait, jokes still spilling from their lips like poison from a cracked bottle. They didn't notice the weight that clung to them now. They didn't feel the shift, the mark they'd left, not on the man, but on themselves. One day, perhaps they would. One day, maybe, they'd see the photo they took and feel it burn. The old man remained unmoved, staring ahead. His cap was still on the ground. But something else now occupied the space between them, a rift not of words, but of meaning. He had offered them a chance to recognize something greater than themselves. They had chosen to mock it, and in doing so, they had made it immortal. Humiliation only works on those who believe your opinion matters. And he didn't. Not then, not now, not ever. As the sun lowered itself behind the rooftops, the amber light crawled across the cracked sidewalk and touched the brim of the cap still lying there, now dried at the edges, the silver thread still catching glints of day like a beacon buried in grit. The old man glanced down at it, not with urgency, not with sorrow, but with the kind of reverence reserved for things only he understood. He did not pick it up. He didn't need to. The soil would not erase what had already been etched into time. Inside the squad car, the younger officer posted the photo, typing a quick caption that reeked of smugness, but his fingers paused for just a breath longer than expected. Something about the man's stillness, the stare that hadn't flinched, the hand that hadn't trembled, it lingered, unsettled him. He wouldn't admit it. He couldn't name it, but it was there. The photo went live, the likes trickled in, but he didn't smile. The old man adjusted his seat, slowly, carefully, not weary, but measured. His hands rested again on the steering wheel, exactly where they had started. His gaze lifted to the road ahead, and though he had not moved an inch, he had crossed a distance they would never understand. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. It was just a reminder. Not all soldiers carried rifles. Some carried silence like a sword, and some uniforms never came off. They just sank deeper into the skin, where no one could mock them. The cap lay forgotten beneath the dying light, its threads soaked in oil and silence, but the old man's hands returned to the wheel with the precision of ritual. No tremor, no hesitation, only quiet control, a discipline too deep for boys with badges to comprehend. Yet the moment lingered, unspoken and unresolved, and the younger officer, still fuming at the man's refusal to bend, barked out, "All right, let's see some If you're going to loiter like you own the place, at least prove who you are." There was no threat in his voice, only entitlement, the kind born of habit, not authority. The wallet creaked open like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Leather cracked at the edges, soft from time and use, not neglect. The man extracted a folded driver's license and, behind it, a military veteran's identification card. Battered, the edges warped, The laminate bubbled from years of sweat, sun, and repetition. He handed both forward with the same calm resolve that had carried him through things far more threatening than arrogance in uniform. The brown-haired officer took them without a word, barely glancing before handing the ID to his partner, who looked at it with the exaggerated skepticism of someone reviewing a counterfeit bill in a dim casino. "What is this? A souvenir?" he said, holding it between two fingers like it smelled wrong. "Man, this thing's older than my dad." His partner chuckled. "Says here he's a vet, but look at this thing. Hell, I've seen better fakes at a high school prank." He flicked on the flashlight from his phone and shoved it within inches of the old man's face. The light hit with cruel indifference, forcing his eyes to narrow under the glare. "You trying to scam us, huh? Think this earns you something?" The man didn't answer. The light didn't make him blink. "You think this gets you out of trouble? This crusty old card?" The officer sneered, pulling it back and flipping it over like it might magically authenticate itself. "It's not even in the system. You hear that?" he said, raising his voice now as if the absence of validation meant absence of truth. "Not in the system." The second officer raised his phone to his ear, speaking in a bored tone into dead air. "Yeah, run a check for me. Old guy, military ID, probably forged." He paused for effect, then shrugged theatrically. "Nope, nothing's coming up. Looks like this guy might be dead. Hey." He turned to the old man with a grin full of teeth. "Are you supposed to be in the database of fallen soldiers? 'Cause that's the only place I can find you." The laughter that followed was sharp and hollow, a cruel echo that filled the space between them with something far colder than any weapon. It wasn't just mockery. It was dismissal, erasure, the kind of psychological scraping that doesn't leave bruises but leaves people hollow. "Maybe the system forgot you, old man. Maybe it never had you in the first place." The man didn't flinch, but when he extended his hand to retrieve the card, the officer didn't place it back. He dropped it, not with anger, not with haste, but with the same casual contempt reserved for empty receipts or used tissues. It fluttered down, bounced once on the man's lap, then fell into the crevice between the seat and the door. "Oops," the officer muttered. "Not sorry?" The second officer snorted. "Might as well let him keep the trash. No one else would want it." But as the man reached down to retrieve the ID, his fingers brushed the corner of the laminate, where a hairline tear had formed. The motion split it further, leaking a smear of dark blue ink onto his fingertips. He paused, looked at the stain, then closed his hand, slowly, folding his fingers into a fist as if wrapping the past tight so it wouldn't spill further. They saw none of it. They were already turning, already satisfied, already certain that whatever honor he had once worn was now expired, invalid, irrelevant. They had stripped him of papers and declared those papers worthless. But there was no paperwork for dignity, and no database for what he had buried. The brown-haired officer lingered a step longer, eyes narrowing as if unsatisfied with the wound he'd already inflicted. "Tell me something," he said, voice slower now, calculated like a knife pressed into soft wood. "How does it feel knowing that no one remembers, that you bled for a country that doesn't even keep your name on file?" He leaned in, resting one hand on the truck door, the other still holding the flashlight, now idle but symbolic. "You carry those cards like they mean something, like the world still cares. But the world moved on. It left you back there, in some desert, some jungle, wherever it was they told you to shoot," his partner added. "Maybe he's one of those guys who buys old IDs at antique stores, gets off on pretending he mattered." He chuckled, proud of the cruelty tucked behind the joke. "Bet he's got a fake Purple Heart at home, right next to the plastic medals they sell at swap meets." The old man looked at them, not with rage, not with heartbreak, just with a calm so steady it was infuriating. He didn't blink, didn't frown, just stared like a man watching flames eat something long since turned to ash. His silence was no longer defensive, it was an indictment. Still, the officers weren't finished. "You think you get to park that rusted junk here? Flash some ancient card and get a salute? Newsflash. You're not special. You're a statistic. You're someone whose name faded from relevance before Facebook even existed." The man didn't reach for the card again. He left it where it had fallen, creased, wet with ink, now as fragile as the memory it tried to prove. Instead, he leaned back slowly, letting his spine settle against the worn seat, his body forming a silhouette not of defeat but of resolve. He had nothing to offer them, not a word, not a plea, not a reaction. And that, more than anything, enraged them. The flashlight clicked off. The voice softened into something venomous. "We can bring you in, you know, for failing to comply, for loitering, for obstruction." The brown-haired one was closer now, face level with the window, breath fogging the edge of the glass. "But we won't, because dragging you downtown would be a waste of gas, and no one would post your bail anyway." His partner chimed in, deadpan. Probably couldn't even remember who to call. They laughed again, but it landed weaker than before. There was something in the stillness of the truck, the motionless figure within it, that gnawed at their performance, as if somehow they were being judged, not from above, not from within the law, but from beneath it, from that deep buried place where real service lives, untouched by ceremony or approval. The old man's fingers twitched slightly. He wiped the ink from his hand using the edge of his sleeve, slow and deliberate. The stain remained, faint but indelible. He didn't look at them again. He didn't need to. Their reflection was already smeared across the cracked surface of his ID. The sun had fallen lower now, casting long shadows that draped over the patrol cars and spilled across the cracked pavement, like memories too tired to stand upright. The officers began to drift back toward their vehicles, the performance complete in their minds, the target humiliated, the story ready for retelling over beers or in locker rooms thick with ego. But the man remained. One officer tossed the man's wallet back through the open window, not returned, but thrown like junk mail into a bin. It landed with a dull slap on the passenger seat. The worn leather darkened from where the ink-stained ID had bled into it. "Keep your paperwork, hero," he said. Voice dry, smile gone. "Next time you try to play veteran, make sure your story comes with a barcode." The door of the cruiser slammed harder than it needed to. The other officer pulled out his phone, flipping through the photos again, each swipe a quiet admission that something didn't feel finished. He stared at one image, a close-up of the man's face, eyes half lit by the flashlight glare, calm under fire. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the delete button, then saved the image instead. Back in the truck, the old man sat still as marble. He didn't reach for the wallet. He didn't clean the ink. He stared at the space beyond the windshield where the officers had stood. His fingers flexed once, like a soldier checking the weight of a trigger he no longer needed. There had been no shouting, no struggle, no resistance, but the wound was there, raw and wide and unseen. They hadn't taken anything material. They hadn't used fists or batons or bullets, but they had pressed on something sacred, and in that pressure, they exposed what the system too often ignored, that the cost of dignity is not always paid in noise. Sometimes it's paid in silence. Sometimes it bleeds slowly. The cap was still on the ground. The ID was still bent. The ink was still wet. The man finally looked down, not at the hat, not at the badge, but at his hand, the one with the ink, the one that had held the proof of service and found it called counterfeit. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, smearing the blue into his skin, as if accepting that some stains are not meant to be washed away. He didn't speak, he didn't move, but in that stillness was a power untouched by protocol, a declaration not of victory or vengeance, but of endurance. He had given his country everything, and now not even a card with his name on it could prove he existed. The ink had barely dried on his palm, the cap still lay untouched, and the sun continued its descent as if none of it mattered. But the silence, that unshakable, unwavering silence, had begun to wear on the officers like a splinter beneath skin. What began as mockery had curdled into something meaner, quieter, more personal. The old man's lack of resistance, his refusal to flinch, to fold, to even offer them the insult of a word, it irritated them in a way that felt primal. It was supposed to be easy. The script called for submission or rage, not this eerie calm that turned every insult into a boomerang. He was supposed to bark back, or shrink, but he did neither. The brown-haired officer stepped forward again, slower now, crouching beside the truck window, like a wolf studying prey that wouldn't run. "You think you're better than us?" he hissed, voice low but taut. "You think you're some kind of monument, just 'cause you can sit still and act holy?" His face inched closer, the air between them hot with contempt. "You sit there, don't blink, don't speak. What is that, dignity? You think silence makes you superior?" The old man didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. His stillness was a wall they couldn't scale. His eyes, half shrouded by shadow, remained locked on the middle distance, as if he were still in some other place, one where things like this didn't matter, or mattered too much to react. Without warning, the officer clicked his flashlight back on and shoved the beam straight into the man's eyes. No questions, no commands, just raw, invasive light. "Look at me," he said, but the man didn't blink. "I said, look at me." The light didn't move. Neither did the man. That was when the second officer, now simmering with frustration, yanked open the truck door. The creak of metal on metal cut through the air like a blade. "Get out," he snapped. No reason, no charge, just a demand. The old man didn't move, so the officer grabbed his arm and pulled. The jerk was not gentle. It was not protocol. It was a statement, force without justification. The man's shoulder twisted unnaturally. His body shifted just slightly as the pain bloomed along his arm like heat beneath the skin. But he didn't cry out, didn't struggle. He let the force move him without offering it the satisfaction of resistance. "Get up," the officer barked again, dragging the man to his feet with enough pressure to wrench tendons. The man's face tightened, but not in fear, in control. He stood, barely swaying, his body carrying the weight of years, with a grace that mocked their aggression. The brown-haired officer stepped in front of him again, eyes scanning his face. "Still nothing to say? Still too noble to speak to us?" The man's voice, when it came, was low, even, firm. "Am I permitted to remain silent?" The officer's lip curled. "Not on my shift." The answer was so blunt, so raw in its disregard for legality it rang louder than a scream. The second officer laughed dryly. "You hear that? He thinks we follow rules. That's rich." He stepped back for a second, like artists admiring a nearly finished painting, but it wasn't satisfaction on their faces. It was frustration. Somehow he was still standing, still quiet, still whole. "Guys like this," one muttered, voice pitched low. "They don't need a warning. They need a reminder. A cold, metal one." Yeah, the other nodded, eyes on the man's wrists. "Some people need to relearn the law. With handcuffs." The cuffs weren't drawn yet, but the threat in the air was colder than steel. The officers hovered close, their presence no longer performative, but predatory. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was ritual, a rite of dominance, a game where the rules had been discarded the moment the old man refused to play along. The brown-haired officer moved in again, his body language tight with control he didn't possess. "What do you think this is? A protest? You think standing still is resistance?" He circled the old man like a dog testing a tether. "We tell you to speak, you speak. We tell you to move, you move. But here you are, thinking silence makes you untouchable." The second officer leaned in beside him, their shadows now cast across the man's chest like vultures descending. "Guys like him are dangerous," he said, voice pitched just loud enough for his partner. "They make others think they've got a choice, that they can ignore us if they stay calm enough. Maybe he thinks he's still in command." The first added with a smirk, "Maybe he forgot whose boots he's under now." The flashlight flicked on again, not as a tool, but as a weapon. The beam scorched the air, swept back across the man's face, searching for cracks, for weakness, for that inevitable moment when silence would collapse under sustained pressure. But none came. "You deaf, old man?" the officer snapped, or just too proud to play along. He didn't answer. He just blinked once, slow, deliberate. And that blink, so subtle, so maddening, was gasoline to the flame of their insecurity. The second officer stepped behind him, grabbed his wrist, twisted, not hard enough to break, but hard enough to sting, to warn, to say, "We could, we might, we're close. Don't make us escalate," he hissed. "I'm not resisting," the man said, calm like a stone in a river. "I am standing still." Answer, measured, articulate, unbothered, landed like a slap. "You think that makes you smart?" The first officer sneered. "You think this little Zen act is working?" The silence returned, thick and deliberate, and one of them whispered, "He's baiting us," then snapped the line. The other muttered, but neither moved, because deep down they knew something had shifted. This wasn't a man they were humiliating anymore. This was something else. Something larger, and every second he didn't flinch, every breath he didn't waste on defense was turning their power into theater, and they were starting to feel like the ones on display. The street remained silent around them, but the scene itself roared with the tension of imbalance. The old man's breathing was steady, too steady. His silence was a refusal, and in that refusal he'd peeled back their uniforms, their posture, their badges, exposing the hollowness behind it all. "You think not talking protects you?" the brown-haired officer snapped, stepping forward again. "That's not how this works. That's not how we work." He reached down and grabbed the man's wrist again, tighter this time. This is what happens when you think you're untouchable." The second officer chimed in with a sneer. "Silence is complicity. You know that phrase? You've heard that one, haven't you, soldier?" He spat the word like it was an insult, like it was a stain on his tongue. "You think you're a hero? You're a suspect. You're a threat, wrapped in nostalgia." The man didn't flinch, but he did speak. One line, measured, served so men like you wouldn't need to raise your hands. The silence that followed that sentence was heavier than any sound. It cracked something in the air, something that couldn't be undone. The officer holding him let go, not because of mercy, but suddenly the moment felt recorded, even if no camera was in sight. "You don't get to hide behind your service," the other one growled. "That war you fought, that was ages ago. This is now. This is South Hill. This is us." The man straightened his posture, despite the pain in his shoulder, despite the discomfort. Even though he stood alone, between two men with the law sewn onto their chest, he stood taller, not because he could win, but because he refused to be small. "You're right," he said. "This is now." The officers hesitated. "You boys have badges," he continued, "but you're not the law. You're the mirror." The insult landed so quietly, so powerfully, that they didn't even respond. They couldn't. For a second, they weren't officers. They were boys in uniforms, mocked not by volume, but by accuracy. They looked at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. Not regret, not fear, just unease. The sense that they'd miscalculated. "That's it," one of them muttered, reaching for the handcuffs now, not with rage, but with the mechanical motion of someone trying to reset control. "Step back, hands behind your back." The man didn't resist. He didn't protest. He didn't plead. He turned, but not in surrender, in strategy. And in that turn, something ancient and undeniable echoed louder than sirens. He had never resisted, but they would never forget the cost of trying to make him submit. He turned slowly, wrists slack, breath measured, not out of compliance, but because yielding gave them nothing to strike. That turn, quiet and calculated, had unsettled more than resistance ever could, and as his shoulders straightened despite the dull throb down his arm, one of the officers, flustered but unwilling to admit it, tugged at the collar of his uniform, undid a single button, and yanked it open just enough to expose the brass badge pinned beneath. It gleamed, not proudly, but like a warning. "You see this?" the brown-haired officer said, tapping his chest like it was sacred. "This is the law. You don't have to understand it. You don't even have to like it. It just needs to be followed." The man's gaze didn't flinch. He looked at the badge, not with fear or reverence, but with a kind of restrained pity. "That's not what it used to mean," he said, voice low, clear, and steady. "You wear that like it's a weapon." "It is," the officer snapped. "Law is force, order, compliance, not opinion." The second cop stepped forward, pulling the cuffs from his belt and letting them dangle. clinking softly like a distant bell tolling the end of something. Want to make this complicated, old man? I call this civic education, American style. The man glanced at the cuffs. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his hands. His eyes lifted instead to the badge, to the arrogance behind it, to the hollow certainty written in the younger man's jaw. That badge used to mean something, he said. Now it's just brass on borrowed time. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. That's rich coming from someone whose time ran out years ago. You don't know time, the man replied. Not until it's standing behind you. Laughter, short, sharp, nervous, broke from the second officer. He stepped in, slapped his partner's shoulder, like this was sport, like this was banter, like the man in front of them was some street corner curiosity, not the spine of a story too heavy for them to carry. We're not just enforcing laws, he smirked. We're teaching a soldier how to kneel. And that was it. The line drawn without flinching. The philosophy is exposed without shame. This wasn't policing, it was a performance. Power, played loud and ugly for the sake of reminding someone who dared to remember otherwise that their memory no longer held weight. The old man looked at them both. His voice remained soft. You're not teaching, you're rehearsing. Because you need to believe it works. The smile faded. The cuffs stopped swaying. The gap between posturing and panic narrowed by a breath. The officer's jaw tensed. You want a citation? He spat. You're obstructing. The old man blinked once. Is silence obstruction now? No, the cop barked, but arrogance is. The other officer took a step around the truck, walking a slow circle, hand brushing his holster. Not drawing, just reminding. You think because you've got years on us, you're above this? He scoffed. You're not above anything. You're under jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction. Your law, the man murmured. Damn right. The first officer growled. This is my district, my call, and out here that badge means what I say it means. There it was again. Authority as self-declaration, as costume, as script rewritten by the wearer. The man's eyes moved slowly between the two, pausing on the flash of steel, the puffed chest, the postured stance. So, no rule of law, he said. Only law of men. The officer nodded like he'd won a debate. And men, the old man continued, make mistakes. The flash of frustration returned, quick and sharp. You just made one. But it didn't land. The man wasn't fighting them. He was outlasting them. Every word he spoke was a mirror, and they hated the reflection. You've got 10 seconds to comply, the second cop snapped. To what? The man asked. To humiliation? To the theater? To lawful orders, the first snapped. Spoken by whom? By officers of the law. The man tilted his head. Then act like it. Silence dropped. Heavier than anything said. The man didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In a world shouting orders, stillness was revolution, and they felt it. One officer stepped forward again, this time not to command, but to confirm. You think this is going to play out in your favor? The old man didn't answer. Because it already was. You want to test the system? The first officer pressed, stepping closer, breath heavy with effort. Not from exertion, but from trying to maintain control of a situation slipping through his hands. Let's see how the system treats you when you're in the back of a cruiser. Let's see what your silence gets you then. The man stood motionless, his expression unchanged. I've been in worse cages, he said, on worse days. Watched better men bleed beside me. You think this frightens me? The second officer glanced toward his partner, then back at the man, suddenly unsure whether to escalate or exit. But pride is a dangerous thing in the hands of those armed with too much and trained with too little. The cuffs came out again, held between two fingers like a badge of honor. Turn around, the officer demanded, louder now, as if decibels might replace authority. The man did not move. The officer's voice cracked. I said, turn around. And then, in the stillness, the man spoke, calm, steady, unshaken. No warrant, no charge, no cause. Just costume and anger. You want to play lawyer now? The first officer shouted. I want you to remember, the man said, voice lower now, almost intimate, what it felt like to look in a mirror before you put that uniform on, before the badge became a mask. before power replaced principle. The words cut deeper than a scream. There was no dramatic gesture, no resistance, just truth laid bare like bone under skin. One officer turned away, his jaw clenched, walking back toward the squad car like retreat was strategy. The other held his ground, but the fire in his stance had dimmed to a flicker. They had come for submission. Instead, they found a lesson, one they couldn't teach, couldn't control, couldn't forget. And though no punches were thrown, no sirens wailed, no shots echoed, their authority had already fractured, not by force, but by the refusal to fall. The first officer's hand hovered over his belt, not quite drawing, not quite retreating. The silence had turned toxic, not because it lacked words, but because it forced reflection. He glanced down at the badge again, as if it might reaffirm his place in this moment, might remind him he still owned the street, still owned the rules, but it didn't gleam like power anymore. It looked dull, cheapened under scrutiny. "You think because you wore a uniform once, you're untouchable?" he asked, the words slipping out thinner, emptier. "You think that patch on your shoulder was a shield forever?" The man looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of pity that cracked louder than rage. "No," he said, "but I knew what it stood for. That's the difference." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. He had stopped recording. He had stopped posturing. His partner was unraveling. And the old man hadn't even raised his voice. "So what now?" the officer demanded, voice brittle. "You gonna walk away like some martyr?" The old man didn't move. "I haven't walked away from anything in my life." "Then comply," the first cop spat. "I did. I stopped. I listened. I waited. But you didn't come for the law. You came for a lesson you never expected to learn." The second cop stepped forward, not out of aggression now, but desperation. "What are you trying to prove?" "That power without restraint is just fear in uniform." It hung there, final, precise, unshakable. "You could be on your knees right now," the officer said, voice cracking, eyes glassy with something that wasn't remorse, wasn't anger, was just lost. "But I'm not," the man answered, voice steady as ever, "because I remember what it means to kneel, and who I did it for." One officer stepped back. The other clenched the cuffs tighter, but didn't move. And then, without ceremony, without a word, the old man turned around, not to flee, not to surrender, but to return to his truck, every step a reminder. Real power doesn't shout, it endures. And they let him, not because they chose to, but because they couldn't stop him. The old man was halfway into his seat again, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting flat against the wheel, when the first sound, almost imperceptible, cut through the heavy silence, the crunch of slow tires pressing into gravel, not loud, not hurried, a sound too measured to be random. The officers turned in unison, as if pulled by an unseen string, their confidence thinning like steam under cold air. From the far end of the street, a black SUV slid into view, moving without lights, gliding like a shadow too sure of its place to need permission. The air tensed. Gravity shifted. The power in the space began to redraw itself, not with bluster, but with arrival. There was no engine roar, no siren, no signal, yet the very presence of the vehicle carried authority that neither badge nor gun could summon. The SUV was matte black, windowless in the back, no plates, no stickers, just a ghost painted in asphalt, moving like it had nothing to prove and nothing to explain. The old man didn't move at first. He just raised his eyes, met the vehicle's approach with the calm of someone who'd seen worse machines deliver worse ends. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes, not in fear, not in surrender, in recognition. The first officer's hand dropped instinctively to his belt, fingers brushing against the handle of his taser, not drawing it, but aware now that the game had changed and they were no longer the player. The second one stiffened, jaw clenched, posture shifting subtly, unsure whether to assert or retreat. The SUV continued forward until it filled the space between the two patrol cars, not parked but claiming territory. It stopped dead center, its glossy surface absorbing the fading sunlight like a silent verdict. The door clicked once, loud in the quiet, and a man stepped out, not uniformed, not branded, but unmistakable. He wore a dark, tailored suit, the kind made from silence and secrets, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He moved with the weight of decisions that changed maps and men. As he walked to the back, one of the cops took a step forward, breath caught halfway between question and objection, but the man never broke stride. He opened the rear passenger door like unlocking a vault, and then, from within, another figure emerged. No medals, no bars, no visible signs of rank, just presence, pure, undiluted. The man who stepped out was younger than the old soldier but bore the same stillness, the same deliberate grace. His eyes scanned the scene not with surprise but with recognition, like a chess master walking into a room mid-game and instantly seeing 10 moves ahead. He didn't speak, either. Not yet. He simply straightened his jacket, adjusted the sleeve of his watch, and stepped onto the pavement as if stepping into history. The two officers stood frozen. Whatever assumptions they had carried were now unraveling at the seams. The old man's hand moved to his chest, pressing gently, not in pain but like someone feeling for the pulse of fate. His fingers curled briefly over the faded patch sewn inside his jacket where a medal had once been pinned, long ago, and long since put away. The air changed. No one told them to. It just obeyed. The man in the suit stepped aside, giving room but not deference. The figure from the back seat now stood fully revealed, tall, unarmed, and unmistakably in command without uttering a word. There was no badge, no ribbon, no rank insignia, just the kind of posture that could make a room stand still, the kind forged in fire, not in office chairs. The first officer blinked hard, as if willing the moment to reset, but the old man hadn't moved. He stood still, one hand against his chest, the other resting by his side, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "What is this?" the second officer whispered, more to himself than anyone else, but it came out louder than he intended. The man in the suit said nothing. He simply turned to the younger officer with a gaze that didn't blink, didn't flex, didn't ask, it informed. And with that look alone, the officer's fingers curled into a fist at his side, shame burning down the back of his neck. The man in the vest said nothing to the cops. Instead, his eyes found the old man, and for a moment, just a breath, he paused. It was a recognition older than names, forged in the kind of silence that didn't need filling, the kind passed from soldier to soldier, not through orders, but through battles. Survived together or apart, the kind that spoke not of rank, but of earned gravity. Then, quietly, the younger man took 2 steps forward and opened his hand, not in greeting, not in command, but in something weightier, as if to say, "I'm here, I saw, I know." The old man gave a near invisible nod, then dropped his gaze. Not in defeat, not in submission, but like someone receiving a verdict they had waited for years to hear. The first officer tried to speak again, voice rising an octave too high. "You can't just interrupt a traffic stop. There's protocol." There was no stop. The man in the suit finally said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet. There was a theater. "And now it ends." The second officer bristled. "You don't have jurisdiction here." "Neither did you," the suited man replied without raising his voice. And that was the end of that. He walked slowly toward the police cruiser, stopping between the 2 men like a judge at sentencing. The SUV hadn't moved. It didn't need to. It had already rewritten the scene just by arriving. The neighborhood watched, from behind curtains and screens, nobody speaking, nobody filming, as if something sacred was unfolding, not because it was sanctioned, but because it demanded reverence. The street that had moments ago been a stage for mockery was now a tribunal of silence. The older man took 1 step forward, not toward the officers, not toward the SUV. No one moved to stop him. They couldn't, not because they didn't want to, but because they no longer knew how. The system they carried in their holsters and stitched into their sleeves had just met something older, something deeper, and it didn't know what to do with it. The man in the suit said nothing further. He returned to his place beside the SUV, arms behind his back. The younger man who had exited last walked toward the old man, step by step, not hurried, not slow, just inevitable. When he was within a foot of the old soldier, he paused. "You still wear it," the young man said quietly, not pointing to the jacket or the boots or the scars. He meant something else. The old man nodded once. "Some things don't come off," he replied. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder now, no need for history books or introductions. The past had arrived, not to be remembered, but to be reckoned with. Behind them, the police stood like statues, chipped at the edge. And beside them, the black SUV waited, unblinking, and for the first time in the entire day, the old man smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, but like someone who had been waiting for a sunrise that finally came. The younger man gave a nod to the suit, who immediately opened the door of the SUV again, but no one rushed. There was no panic, just a sequence that moved with the inevitability of respect. The suited man turned once more to the officers. "You're going to walk away now," he said, like it was an instruction more than an option. "You're not going to file a report. You're not going to spin a story. You're going to remember this, and then you're going to disappear." They didn't answer. They just stood there, deflated, their posture collapsed inward. Uniforms no longer armor, but cloth. The younger man put a hand gently on the old man's shoulder. "Time to go home, sir," he said, but there was no pity in his tone, only reverence. The old man exhaled, not tired, not broken, just releasing something he had held too long. He walked slowly toward the SUV, and the street parted in silence. The vehicle swallowed him up, not like a beast, but like a vault closing on something sacred. The door clicked shut. The engine purred. Still no lights, no signals, and the SUV rolled away as silently as it had arrived. The officers remained rooted, still processing, unraveling. Only when the taillights vanished down the block did one of them mutter, "Who the hell was that?" And the other answered with something between awe and fear, "Somebody who didn't need a badge." The air remained still for a long time after, as if the ground itself was unsure whether to breathe. Nothing had exploded. No gun had fired. Yet something irreversible had happened. The kind of shift that no report could capture. The kind of silence that rewrote authority without a single word. And South Hill would remember that day not for violence, not for scandal, but for the moment when men with weapons found themselves disarmed by history itself. The black SUV had barely turned the corner when the silence shattered, not from noise, but from what was left behind. The air still held its breath, and the weight of what had just occurred pressed down like a thundercloud refusing to break. The two officers stood, hollowed, not by force, but by the undeniable erosion of their authority. That's when the younger man turned back. He had not left with the vehicle. He had remained. He walked slowly toward them now, not out of obligation, not for vengeance, but because something needed to be said, and it had to be said right here, with their pride still raw and the truth still echoing from the street. The old man's son moved with the precision of a soldier, and the calm of a man who had seen worse and refused to flinch again. As he approached, he pulled a thin black wallet from inside his suit jacket and opened it with deliberate care, holding it at chest height, angled not to show power but to prove the point. Inside gleamed a Pentagon command badge, not a shield of city enforcement, but the weight of federal steel. Military grade, silence with teeth. He held it just long enough for the two men to see it, to absorb its implications, and then he put it away. "The man you just pulled out of that truck," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut glass, "is the only man I've never been able to defeat in a fight." His eyes didn't blink. His jaw didn't tighten. It wasn't a threat. It was an elegy in progress. The taller officer shifted his weight, discomfort rippling down his uniform. The other, the one with the nervous smirk, tried to laugh. "You serious?" he sneered, glancing at his partner. "You mean this guy?" "I mean," the man said, turning ever so slightly so the sun hit the silver bar still clipped to his collar, "Senior Training Officer 82nd Airborne Division, 3rd Brigade Combat Team. And also, my father." The two officers fell back half a step. It wasn't dramatics, it was instinct, as if some tectonic plate had just shifted beneath them. The laugh died before it ever reached the throat. Silence returned, but it didn't bring safety. "You just made a mistake," he said. "Not because of who he is to me, but because of what he means to men like me." His voice wasn't raised. It was measured, precise, like a weapon being assembled. The officer with the short temper opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward his partner for a cue, but there was nothing left to borrow. You mocked his past like it was a joke. You paraded your badge like it made you righteous. You used the law not to protect, but to humiliate. He stepped closer now. His presence didn't threaten. It demanded reality. But here's what you don't get. There are men in this country whose silence carries more weight than your words ever will. He leaned in, and you just tried to silence one of them. The wind picked up. Somewhere a car door slammed in the distance, a reminder that the world outside was still moving, still unaware that here, on this quiet street, a nation's conscience had been cracked open. The sun stood tall, his posture straight as a blade. "You don't have to apologize to me," he said. "You don't have to apologize to him, but you will live with what you did today." The taller cop finally found his voice. "We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," the son interrupted crisply. "You meant to degrade. You meant to dominate. You meant to make yourselves feel like giants next to a man you didn't think would fight back." The other cop swallowed hard, but said nothing. "You've had your say," the son added. "Now you'll have your silence, and you'll carry that louder than any arrest record." He turned back to his father again, stepped closer, and this time, when he spoke, his voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from restraint long held. "I should have been here sooner," he said. "I should have stood between you and this kind of cruelty a long time ago." The old man didn't respond with words. He placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder, the same hand that once held rifles, that once pulled bleeding comrades out of fire, that once saluted coffins wrapped in flags. That hand said everything. The son nodded, then stepped aside and gestured toward the SUV, still idling at the end of the block. "We're done here," he said. "This street doesn't deserve another second of your time." But the son didn't leave immediately. He turned one last time to face the officers. His tone had softened, but not relented. "You think power comes from the weight on your belt," he said, eyes steady. "But real power is what you do when no one's watching. Today you had that chance, and you failed." The one with the smug mouth turned red. Not from anger, but exposure. He tried to pivot the blame. "How were we supposed to know who he was?" "You weren't," the son replied. "That's the point. You don't treat people with decency because of who they are. You treat them with decency because of who you are, or who you should be." The son closed the space between them with slow, certain steps. "You had a choice. You always do. And now you'll have consequences." He didn't need to threaten. The moment had already judged them. You wear your badge like armor, but men like him wore sacrifice. There's a difference. The street was still. Even the wind seemed hesitant now. The two men in uniform were no longer figures of control. They were cautionary tales, stripped of illusion by one truth, too heavy to deny. Turning back, the son reached into his coat pocket once more, not for an ID this time, but for a folded paper. He held it between two fingers, then offered it without fanfare. "This is a statement for the record," he said, "filed with military oversight. You're being named in an internal review." The paper was taken without resistance. The officers didn't ask questions. They already knew the answers would only damn them further. "I'll see you again," the son added, "but not as a witness, as a reminder." Then he returned to his father, placing a hand on his back as they walked in unison toward the SUV. Each step was deliberate, as though reclaiming the ground one footprint at a time. When they reached the vehicle, the son opened the door for the old man, not out of deference, but acknowledgement. The old man paused before entering, glancing one last time at the place where his worth had been weighed and found wanting by fools. He didn't glare. He didn't speak. He simply looked, and in that look was the entire ledger of a life lived for a flag that had too often forgotten his name. Then he entered, closed the door, and with a nod from the driver, the vehicle moved forward. No words followed. No crowd. Just two uniforms standing alone in a street that no longer felt theirs, and above them, the sound of nothing at all. Later, long after the SUV had vanished from sight and the street had resumed its indifferent stillness, one of the officers, his lips pale and jaw tight, muttered under his breath, "We didn't just pick the wrong guy, we picked the wrong world to play God in." The other didn't respond. He just stared down at the piece of paper, still trembling in his hand, It might have weighed a few grams, but it felt like 100 pounds. He looked around, almost as if expecting someone to come out and say this was a test, a drill, a cruel joke. But no one came. There were no shadows to hide in anymore. The silence had spoken louder than a siren ever could. Inside the SUV, the son sat beside his father. Neither said anything for a moment. The road ahead stretched open, untouched by the noise they left behind. Finally, the son broke the silence, not with apology, not with comfort, just the truth. "I was trained to lead men into battle," he said, "but I never learned how to protect you from this country." The old man didn't answer immediately. Then, with a slow breath, he said, "You were never supposed to." And with those words, the burden that had hovered over them, one born from wars fought overseas and wars endured at home, began to shift. Back on the street, the two cops remained frozen. What had started as routine had become a revelation. What they had tried to control had exposed their hollowness. What they had tried to belittle now stood taller than both of them combined. And even though no shots were fired, even though no laws were technically broken, something in them had been shattered permanently. Because sometimes the most devastating battles leave no blood, just silence that never lets you sleep again. General Keene didn't need volume to command silence. His voice, low and deliberate, rolled out like a slow-moving thunderhead. The sound of it didn't just interrupt the street, it changed the chemistry of the air. "I died once," he said, eyes locked on the two officers as if naming their exact weight. "And the man you dragged from that truck brought me back with nothing but his hands and a will stronger than war." He stepped closer, slow and heavy like memory itself. Then, with a quiet pull at his collar, he exposed the scar, a deep, uneven line tracing down the side of his neck. Red still in some spots. A violent signature of a past too real to fake. "He shoved his hand into this," Keene said, voice flat and cutting. There was no morphine, no medics, just sand, blood, and a man who didn't blink when he saw death coming for me. The words didn't echo, they carved. The brunette officer who had mocked the veteran's cap earlier shifted on his feet. His lips, once so quick with laughter, now twitched with something closer to dread. His partner, the taller one, the one who'd grabbed the old man's arm like it was trash, swallowed hard, but said nothing. Their silence wasn't guilt. It was the slow crawl of realization that they'd poked something far bigger than either of them could control. Keene wasn't finished. "No doctor saved me," he said, his tone growing colder, heavier. "No chopper swooped down. No metal stopped the bleeding. Only a soldier, a man with more courage in his silence than you two have in your entire precinct." His stare burned, but he didn't yell. He didn't have to. Shame does the screaming on its own. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper. No, not paper, it was thicker than that. Weathered, protected, revered. He unfolded it slowly as if it might crumble under daylight. The photograph was faded but unmistakable, an image burned into the dust of a rock. Keene, limp and blood-soaked, slung over the back of an old man, his face half hidden by grit but unmistakably alive. The two officers stared at it like it might detonate. "That's your hero," Keene said. "The man you called expired. Outdated. The man you shoved, mocked, and laughed at. That's the only reason I'm standing on American soil with air still in my lungs." He paused, letting it sink in. Not like a lesson, but like a sentence being read aloud in court. One officer blinked too fast, as if trying to keep tears inside. The other took a single half-step back, a movement so slight it would have been missed, if not for the weight it carried. One of them choked out a quiet, broken sound, something between a gasp and the start of a sob. It wasn't contrition. It was fear. The moment a predator realizes it's been clawing at a lion in disguise. Keene pointed at the man in the truck. He didn't demand thanks. He never asked for a parade. But you don't get to rewrite the story because you don't like the ending. You don't get to reduce a warrior to a stereotype and walk away clean. His voice grew darker now. iron behind every word. You don't have to bow to me, but you damn well better bow to him. There were no cheers, no camera flashes, just silence. The kind that pins people to the truth with no room to squirm. Behind him, the old man stood with his shoulders still square, his hands still steady. He didn't gloat, didn't sneer. He simply watched, unshaken, as the weight of decades landed on the backs of two men too hollow to carry them. No sirens rang out. No backup rushed in, but the atmosphere shifted, like justice itself had just pulled up a chair to watch. The veteran's silence wasn't submission, it was force held in reserve. And Keene's words, they weren't a defense, they were an indictment, delivered not in rage, but in a calm so absolute it left no room for rebuttal. Even the wind seemed to pause. Keene reached down and placed the photo on the hood of one of the cruisers. Slow, deliberate, final. He didn't look at the officers again. He turned to his father. "It's done," he said. "No grand declaration, just the truth, just gravity. The kind of ending that isn't the end, but the beginning of someone else's reckoning." The weight of truth didn't settle when Keene spoke. It expanded. The street was still holding its breath from his last words, and yet he stepped forward again, lifting his chin. Not in defiance, but in purpose. His gaze found the lens of a nearby news camera, unblinking, as if daring the entire nation to hear what came next. "I've been decorated," he began, his voice neither boastful nor meek. "I've shaken the hands of 3 presidents. I've worn stars on my shoulders and stood on soil foreign and familiar. But today, I stand here not as a general. I stand here as a son." The words hit harder than commands. They pierced through protocol, stripped rank away, and left the moment raw. Around him, the crowd that had begun to gather was silent, not because they were unsure, but because there was something sacred in what was unfolding. He turned slightly, not to address the camera now, but to speak more intimately, as if the country had pulled a chair close. "My father never spoke of war, not once, not at the dinner table, not during storms, not when I wore my uniform for the first time. He only ever said one thing: being alive is enough. And he said it like a man who'd paid dearly for it." Keene paused, breathing in the weight of inherited silence. "He taught me how to fire a weapon. He taught me how to hold it steady. But he never taught me how to hate, never taught me how to strike back just because I could. Today, I'm not here to punish, I'm here to correct." His voice rose, not in volume, but in authority. The kind that doesn't wait for permission. "I'm invoking immediate jurisdiction under the Joint Military-Civil Cooperation Charter. Both of you are suspended, effective now, pending federal investigation into misuse of force, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming." The officers didn't move. They didn't speak. Whatever arrogance had once propped up their posture was now replaced by a stiff, unwilling surrender. The smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a pale, twitching lip. The taller one's eyes darted left and right, searching for an exit that didn't exist. There was no saving face in this kind of reckoning. No badge was strong enough to block what was coming. Keene turned to his father, who had remained seated this whole time, unmoved, unreadable, yet radiating the kind of presence that made even silence feel like thunder. The son reached down and extended a hand. There was no ceremony in the gesture, only gravity. The old man took it, slowly, and rose. Keene's hand moved instinctively to his father's shoulder, brushing away dust from the faded military cap that had been thrown to the dirt just minutes ago. He placed the cap back where it belonged, not just on his father's head, but on the history that had earned it. The act was simple, but its meaning roared. Keene didn't look back at the officers. He didn't need to. His words had landed, and now it was the silence that held command. "You see," he said, more to the city, to the nation, to the millions watching. "Some of us are handed medals because others kept quiet, because men like my father chose to bear pain instead of passing it on, because he bled and then buried it, because dignity doesn't make speeches, it waits." A flicker passed through the old man's eyes. Moisture, the beginning of a tear, but no drop fell. It was restraint, not weakness, and that restraint, passed down from father to son, was now reshaping what justice looked like. Keene stepped back, the authority still heavy in his voice, but now shaped by something deeper. "This isn't about two bad cops," he said. "It's about the illusion that silence is consent, that if someone doesn't scream, they must not feel pain. My father has screamed in silence for decades. Today you all heard it." One of the reporters tried to speak, but Keene raised his hand, not rudely, just enough to say, "Not now." "This isn't a press moment," he said, gaze turning toward the sky, as if recalling the open desert and the sound of gunfire. "This is a reckoning, and it doesn't come with applause, it comes with accountability." His father's gaze had never left the two officers. He didn't speak, he didn't shake his head, he didn't look away. He simply existed, unbroken, and for the first time in their lives they were forced to acknowledge the measure of a man not through his words, but through what others did in his name. And still, the old man remained silent. Not because he lacked the strength to speak, but because he had already said everything there was to say with his life. Every scar, every rescue, every night survived without a name and a headline, it had all led to this moment. Keene faced the camera one last time, this time speaking not just as a son, but as a soldier who finally understood the weight of silence. "They gave me a medal," he said. "They said I was brave, but I was never braver than the man who taught me that real strength isn't in raising your voice, it's in knowing when not to." And with that, the command ended. No handcuffs, no resistance. Just two officers quietly, sheepishly stepping aside, suspended not only by authority, but by the unbearable shame of having misjudged a giant for a shadow. The last echo of Keene's voice hadn't yet faded when the old man, who had endured humiliation, silence, and a nation's amnesia, finally shifted. He straightened, not as someone fragile, recovering from insult, but as a man reclaiming the full weight of his presence. His eyes, weathered, commanding, undiminished by time, locked onto the two officers like spotlights through fog. When he spoke, it was not loud, it was not theatrical, it was inevitable. "I've seen the blood of my brothers soak into white sand," he said, his tone neither bitter nor broken. "I've carried death in my chest, hidden it, so my son could live long enough to outrank ghosts. But today, you've done something even war couldn't. You made me want to speak." The words cracked the air sharper than any gunshot. The younger officer flinched, as if struck not by force, but by truth too potent to bear. The elder one stiffened, jaw clenched, eyes hollowed with the shame of being seen for what he truly was, not a protector, not an enforcer, but a symptom. The veteran didn't blink. "I'm not afraid of your weapons," he continued, voice growing more grounded, more precise, more lethal in its restraint. "I'm afraid of what stands behind them. Ignorance dressed in uniform, arrogance with a badge. The street, the city, the cameras, everything felt suspended, like the world was finally shutting up to let something sacred unfold. "You think you wear authority," the old man said, every syllable heavy as judgment, "but power without purpose is just noise. You don't need to learn the law. You need to learn how to be men." His words didn't tremble, though his body had seen decades of wear. They landed like verdicts. Final, unquestionable. He stepped forward. One step, that's all. And somehow both officers took one back, involuntarily, as if their instincts were wiser than their careers. "I forgive you," the old man said, eyes narrowing with fire, "because I can. But this country won't. This nation I bled for. It may take longer to forget what you tried to do to me." He then reached up slowly, not with ceremony, but with conviction, and removed the worn U.S. military cap from his head. The sun caught the faint metallic thread of the faded letters as he held it, not above himself, but before him, as if offering something both sacred and burdened. Without a word, he placed it into the open hand of his son. The gesture wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. "Hold it," he said, eyes never leaving the officers, "and don't let anyone step on it again." The cap, dusty and scarred, carried more than memories. It carried bloodlines, values, histories rewritten in silence, and now it passed from father to son not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. Keene didn't look down at it. He didn't need to. He already knew its weight. In the distance, a low rumble pierced the quiet like a warning shot across a dying empire, the sound of military vehicles. Convoys. Reinforcements not sent to enforce violence, but to excavate rot. The street tensed. The two officers, still frozen in the aftermath of their disgrace, looked toward the sound, not with hope, but with the panic of men who had mistaken impunity for invincibility. And yet, the old man's focus never wavered. He looked not at the cavalry, but at the men in front of him. His voice dropped, low, intimate, like a father laying down his final lesson. "Silence is a choice," he said, "and for a long time I chose it. I thought dignity meant endurance. I thought the only thing louder than injustice was restraint. But silence doesn't always heal. Sometimes it enables, and today my silence ends." That was it. No shouting, no vengeance, just the full force of truth, spoken by a man who had held his tongue while the world forgot what valor looks like. Around him, no one moved. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt. Keene stepped beside his father now, not as a shield, but as a reflection. He didn't speak. The moment didn't need more voices. It needed witnesses. The convoy was close enough now that the insignia on the lead vehicle became visible. Federal insignia. Military investigators. The cavalry that didn't fire bullets, but questions. The kind of power that doesn't flash, but peels skin off systems. The old man looked once more at the officers. There was no malice in his stare, only gravity. The kind of gravity that changes people or crushes them depending on what they're made of. He turned then, slow but unyielding, his steps deliberate, and the entire street turned with him. Not physically, but morally. You could feel it. Like a tide being pulled in the direction of something it should have followed long ago. He didn't thank the cameras. He didn't wave. He didn't look back. The moment wasn't his to cherish. It was theirs to reckon with. And in that silence, the country finally heard him. The silence that followed the old man's final words wasn't peace. It was detonation. Not the kind that shatters glass, but the kind that fractures institutions. His footsteps hadn't yet cooled on the asphalt when the first ripples began. By the time the convoy of black military vehicles reached South Hills Precinct headquarters, the media storm had already passed the point of control. Footage of the confrontation looped across every major network. Each replay carving deeper into the nation's conscience like a scalpel made of shame. And it wasn't the volume of the incident that made it powerful. It was the clarity of cruelty, the clarity of arrogance caught red-hand. The clarity of power is finally being held accountable. Behind closed doors, the South Hill Police Department scrambled. The chief of police issued a bland 5-sentence statement claiming deep concern and full cooperation. But concern doesn't erase contempt, and the country had seen the contempt. It was stitched into every smirk, every gesture, every laugh aimed at a man who once dragged comrades from the jaws of death, while these officers couldn't drag themselves out of entitlement. The statement did nothing. It came too late and cost too little. That night, the Department of Defense submitted an official request for an internal military civil investigation into South Hill's policing practices, citing potential civil rights violations against U.S. military veterans. It was clinical on paper, but behind that language was an unmistakable message. No one was above the system, not even the system itself. By morning, a classified memorandum had leaked. Perhaps deliberately, perhaps not. Its contents detonated across social media like wildfire laced with gasoline. The Pentagon was suspending all cooperative operations with South Hill for a minimum of 180 days. No shared training, no equipment exchanges, no federal coordination. In bureaucratic terms, it was surgical. In political terms, it was a guillotine. Inside the department, panic turned into paranoia. Officers avoided eye contact in hallways. Internal affairs suddenly found itself relevant. Whispers became confessions. and the two suspended officers, now radioactive to anyone with a career worth saving, were rushed into mandatory psychological evaluations. But therapy doesn't bleach bigotry, it only measures it. The internet unearthed an old image posted by one of the officers, a photo mocking African-American veterans taken in a bar, captioned with a slur disguised as a joke. It was time-stamped 2 years before the incident. The irony wasn't that it resurfaced, it was that it had ever been buried. In a matter of hours, the entire narrative shifted. What had begun as an act of street-level humiliation was now revealed as a pattern of targeted contempt. General Keane, when asked for comment by reporters outside his temporary quarters in D.C., didn't smile, didn't pause, didn't grandstand. "I'm not looking for someone to blame," he said calmly. "I'm looking for the crack in the wall." And with that, he walked away. No slogans, no victory lap, just a man following the fault lines of a broken system. That same afternoon, a former South Hill officer stepped onto a national talk show. He had left the force 2 years prior under unclear circumstances. Now, with hands folded tightly and voice strained from years of holding back, he told the country, "We were instructed, off the record, to profile old black men driving run-down vehicles. The exact words were, 'If they're still alive, they've slipped through the cracks. Check 'em.'" The audience didn't gasp, they stared. Because it didn't sound like shock, it sounded like confirmation. The truth wasn't new. It was just no longer ignorable. Then came the deeper dig. Military investigators with full clearance and jurisdiction began peeling back layers of South Hill's records, sealed complaints, lost body cam footage, patterns of arrests without warrants, suspicious dismissals of internal reports. All began surfacing. One document, dated 6 months prior, revealed a dismissed civilian claim from a homeless veteran allegedly threatened at gunpoint by the same officer who mocked the military cap. The case had been closed due to lack of supporting evidence. That evidence now sat in a USB drive found inside a locker no one had bothered to scrub. Keane stood in front of the Pentagon press corps and didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His restraint had become a symbol more potent than rage. "This isn't vengeance," he said. "It's maintenance. We don't punish because we hate corruption. We punish because we need the system to breathe again." His words didn't earn applause. They earned action. By midnight, the story had overtaken headlines coast to coast. What began with 2 officers harassing an old man had now grown into a structural inquest, one not rooted in political ideology but in data, documentation, and undeniable public disgrace. No one needed a moral to believe it. The evidence had done the speaking. There were no sermons, no podium-fueled finger-pointing, only reports, photographs, leaked recordings, testimonies from those who had once whispered and now shouted. Keane, refusing the temptation of television lights and performative interviews, remained behind the scenes, pushing only for transparency, not applause. Inside one military file room, an investigator pulled a printout of an old field commendation, the one detailing how the unnamed soldier dragged a half-dead lieutenant through sniper fire. It was signed in smudged ink by 3 witnesses, none of whom had known the man's full name. Until now. That name had become the pulse behind a national reckoning, not because he demanded justice, but because justice could no longer pretend not to know him. The old man never made a statement. He didn't have to. His silence had already infected every corridor of power, not with fear, but with the stinging discomfort of being seen, of being forced to acknowledge that for years, the system had practiced selective vision. This investigation wasn't a lesson in law. It was a mirror, and no institution can survive long when it's forced to look at itself without the comfort of denial. The hearings began without ceremony, without anthem, without the camouflage of patriotism. It was a sterile room. Gray walls, harsh lighting, long tables occupied by military brass and federal oversight agents. But what unfolded inside was anything but colorless. General Keane took his seat near the center, not because he demanded attention, but because truth always migrates to the place where it's been ignored the longest. He wasn't there to defend his father. His presence stood for the thousands who'd worn a uniform and returned not to gratitude, but to suspicion. He sat tall, silent, focused, and beside him, the echo of every forgotten veteran seemed to hold its breath. The two officers, now stripped of their holsters, their confidence, their invisible shield of routine impunity, were called forward. Their names were read without rank. Their titles were not mentioned. What they wore were suits, not uniforms. No badge, no weight of office. Just fabric over skin that had never learned what true service meant. The brunette, once loud, once smug, spoke first. "I was following procedure," he said, arms folded tight, eyes darting between committee members like a man trying to read a script that didn't exist. "I acted by the book." Keene didn't flinch. His voice was like polished stone. "What book?" he asked. "Authorizes the arrest of a man without a warrant, without cause, without threat." There was no need to shout. The question struck with surgical chill. No one in the room answered, least of all the officer, whose silence now spoke more clearly than any testimony. His procedure had been fear, and his training had been ignorant. The second officer tried a different tactic. His eyes glistened, lip trembling, not from regret, but from collapse. "I didn't mean it to go that far," he muttered, cracking under the glare of cameras, of consequence. "I got caught in the moment." One of the investigators leaned forward and tapped a button on the digital display. A still image appeared, him laughing, foot pressing down on a veteran's military cap. Another click. The video played. His voice unmistakable. "Guess this is worth about as much as he is." The sound echoed, louder in its clarity than any courtroom gavel. "No one gets caught in the moment when they're trained to lead," Keene said coldly. "Only cowards use chaos as cover." The military attaché then rose and read aloud an internal report never released before. It was an official combat commendation from a mission in Iraq. The document described a soldier who, under active fire, extracted 12 wounded personnel from a collapsed position. He used his own body as cover, tore his hands open carrying men twice his weight, and refused to evacuate until the last man was safe. He never filed for recognition. He never requested a promotion. That soldier was Keene's father. As the words settled, a question was posed, quietly but with unflinching gravity. "Had this not been your father?" one of the committee members asked, but a stranger with no one to speak for him. "Would this case ever have reached us?" No one answered, because everyone already knew. Keene let the silence linger before offering his response, not to the panel, not to the officers, but to the system itself. "You can polish a badge," he said. "You can shine it until it blinds cameras, but it doesn't hide what's beneath it. A badge doesn't conceal a weak heart. A badge doesn't excuse a brittle soul. A badge doesn't absolve cowardice." His tone was ice, not cruel, but calculated. The brunette officer clenched his jaw as if preparing a retort, but none came. He had used up all his words on the street when he still believed his badge made him untouchable. The gold-plated medal he once wore now seemed gaudy, irrelevant, just a prop no longer backed by legitimacy. His authority had collapsed under the weight of a single man's silence, and now that silence had become the sharpest blade in the room. The final portion of the hearing wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. One final file was submitted into evidence, a compilation of prior complaints filed against the two officers over 5 years. Most had been dismissed. Several never made it past intake. But laid bare in sequence, the pattern was damning. It wasn't just two rogue officers. It was a shield of procedural apathy, a failure stitched into policy, and now it was unraveling. Before the committee adjourned, Keene rose. Not because he was called, but because truth doesn't wait for permission. "We talk about duty," he said, "about loyalty, about sacrifice, but none of that matters when it's used to protect those who pervert it. This hearing isn't about who wears a badge. It's about who deserves one. A badge without honor is just paper wrapped around a bullet." Then he laughed. No applause, no cameras chasing, just footsteps, measured, silent, and irreversible. Keene's final steps out of the hearing chamber didn't close the story. They cracked open the next layer. Behind him, justice had moved swiftly, but not blindly. Within 48 hours, the decision was unanimous. Both officers were discharged from the force with immediate effect. Their names were entered into a federal database banning future employment in law enforcement anywhere in the country. The punishment wasn't symbolic, it was structural. And yet, for Keene, it wasn't enough. He had seen too much rot to settle for 2 scalps. He understood something more sinister, that the real disease wasn't the officers, it was the silence that let them thrive. That silence wore uniforms, held pensions, passed evaluations, and signed off on misconduct reports filed and forgotten. The problem wasn't just who acted, but who never stopped them. So Keene didn't walk away, he walked upward. At a closed military advisory meeting 2 days later, Keene stood without rank pinned to his chest. He didn't need it. His voice carried a weight not derived from medals, but from consequence. "We've spent decades building systems to protect our soldiers abroad," he said, "but we've built almost nothing to protect them when they return." The room didn't interrupt. He had their attention and their complicity. "What happened on that street wasn't an outlier," he continued. "It was a flare in the dark, exposing something we should have seen long ago." He proposed the creation of an independent oversight division, operated jointly by the Department of Defense and Civil Liberties Commission, with the express purpose of monitoring police interactions with U.S. veterans, particularly those from marginalized communities. It would be called the Sentinel Unit. Not a watchdog, not a task force, a mirror, one with memory, one with teeth. Within days, the military convened a special council to begin mapping police departments with documented or suspected histories of civil rights violations. South Hill wasn't the first on the list, but it was the reason the list existed at all. It would be the case subject, the test subject, the warning, and through all of it, the old man remained where he had always been, just out of frame. When reporters reached out for comment, requesting interviews, documentaries, and book deals, he declined them all. He issued only one statement, 14 words, "I don't need your apologies. I need you to rebuild what you let break." No anger, no flair, just the weight of truth dropped into the center of the national conscience like a lead anchor. Keene appeared next before Congress, not to demand vengeance, not to inflate his image, but to fulfill an obligation passed from father to son. The room was packed. Senators leaned forward like school children. The general stood behind the podium, hands steady, eyes unreadable. "The man who raised me never taught me how to speak with fury," he began. "He taught me how to act with integrity. And when a man like that finally chooses to speak, we should all be prepared to listen." No one moved. This country doesn't owe him gratitude. It owes him correction. He then introduced the draft of a new legislative bill, the Veterans Civil Shield Act. Its mission was clear. It would enshrine legal protections for veterans against unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and procedural abuse by local authorities. It would mandate specialized training on trauma-informed policing, and it would embed a civilian audit body with oversight power in any jurisdiction with repeat violations. It wasn't a dream, it was a blueprint. The room didn't erupt into applause. It fell into a stillness heavy with confrontation, because the bill wasn't asking for praise. It was demanding accountability. As the legislative gears began to turn, something stranger happened. People stopped using the old man's name, not out of disrespect, but because a new one emerged. One whispered through headlines, etched into speeches, passed quietly from soldier to soldier. They called him the teacher who never spoke, not as a myth, but as a man. His cap, once tossed to the dirt, now rested behind ballistic glass at a temporary exhibit in the National Museum of Service. The placard below it read, "He endured in silence, so we could confront in truth." Through all of it, he refused to stand on stages, refused to let others paint him as a victim or a hero. He wasn't there to be honored, he was there to hold the mirror, and that mirror was now being welded into law. Keene continued the fight, not from war rooms, but from policy tables. He didn't talk about glory, he talked about risk. He spoke plainly, but with precision. We can't just remove the worst. We must disarm the system that protects them. Some people, he added coldly, aren't punished so they'll suffer. They're punished so we never forget what happens when we don't. The dust of legislative triumph had barely begun to settle when the mayor of South Hill stepped in front of a camera, stiff-backed and thin-lipped, framed by the city seal and 2 American flags, as if borrowed patriotism could soften public fury. With a grave expression that failed to hide the tremble in his jaw, he delivered a carefully curated speech. On behalf of this administration, he began, I offer a sincere apology to Mr. Keene and his father for the regrettable incident that occurred in our city. He paused, scanning his notes, then added the sentence that snapped the country's collective patience. We could not have known. There was no way to foresee this. That one line detonated like rot surfacing through polished concrete. It wasn't regret, it was retreat, not an admission of guilt, but a disclaimer of responsibility, and the nation knew it. They didn't hear sorrow in his tone. They heard calculation. They didn't see a man confronting shame. They saw a politician managing optics. Within the hour, General Keene released a response. It wasn't a press conference. It was a direct-to-camera statement. No background music, no stagecraft, just him and a cold, plain backdrop. You say you couldn't have known, he said, his voice devoid of anger but sharpened by disgust. That phrase, couldn't have known, is how people in power make sure they never have to learn how to remember. He leaned forward slightly. Ignorance isn't a defense, it's a strategy. The video went viral before the mayor's team could finish their damage control memo. Networks replayed Keene's clip next to the mayor's, and the contrast was so stark, it didn't need commentary. One looked like a theater, the other looked like truth with its sleeves rolled up. At a city hall ceremony hastily arranged by the mayor's office, a public relations chess move dressed in bunting and microphones, cameras zoomed in on the old man as the mayor approached him with a practiced look of humility. The applause was sparse, polite at best, and the air buzzed not with appreciation, but suspicion. The mayor extended his hand. The old man didn't take it. Instead, he turned calmly without a word and walked away. A photographer caught the moment from behind, the mayor frozen mid-gesture, his hand hanging awkwardly, while the veteran's back, straight and proud, receded into a crowd that parted like water around a principal. The image went global. No hashtags were needed. The truth was in the posture. When a journalist caught up with the old man outside the building and asked, Sir, what does this apology mean to you? He paused just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. Then he answered, It's not mine to hear. That was all. 7 words, a dismissal more devastating than any outburst. As social media chewed through every angle, a new revelation surfaced. A handwritten letter had been circulated a few days prior, allegedly penned by a concerned, honest police officer in support of the old man, distancing the force from the 2 disgraced officers. It had been read aloud at a community meeting, cited by the mayor in his broadcast, and printed on flyers. But investigative journalists uncovered metadata in the scanned image that traced it back to a city council printer, one accessible only by executive staff. Under pressure, a city hall staffer confessed. The letter had been authored by the mayor's own communications director. What had been presented as organic contrition was exposed as a synthetic balm, engineered not to heal, but to pacify. Public fury reignited, this time not out of outrage, but disgust. A grassroots petition to remove the mayor from office amassed over 1 million verified signatures in a single day. His office was forced to shut down its phone lines. Protesters didn't chant, they stood in rows, arms crossed, mouths closed. The silence was deafening. Keene made no further statement. He didn't need to. The country had learned how to read the message now. Not from speeches, but from what was refused. The old man, too, made no public move, but across the nation, murals began appearing, not of his face, but of his back. Mid-turn, the act of walking away now immortalized as the loudest rejection ever broadcast in silence. In the end, the apology became a textbook example not of humility, but of its counterfeit. The image of the mayor, hand still reaching, frozen in mid-sentence, came to define the cost of posturing over principle. And the man who refused to hear that apology walked away, not to isolate himself, but to remind everyone watching, redemption is not scripted, it's earned. And forgiveness, when tainted by motive, is not forgiveness at all, it's PR dressed as grace. The echo of public rejection still hung in the air, but it wasn't a void, it was a silence filled with clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't beg for interpretation, only acknowledgement. And in that silence, something new was built. Not on stages, not in headlines, but in a room carved out of reverence. At the National Military Museum, tucked between exhibits that documented every war this country had fought, a new gallery opened, not with a ribbon cutting, not with bugles or brass, just with quiet, deliberate footsteps, and a photo placed at the center of it all. Not a war photo, no battlefield, no flag, no uniform in motion. It was a single frame, an old man sitting in a weathered truck, windows rolled down, dignity intact. His back was straight, his hands rested calmly on the wheel. His eyes, caught mid-glance, stared ahead, not with challenge, but with an unspoken warning to anyone who dared look too lightly. Below the photograph, etched into a sleek metal plaque, were the words, "He didn't react," because the whole country was watching. There was no name on it. There didn't need to be. Keene spoke at the private opening ceremony, though he hadn't intended to. Someone had asked him what this moment meant. He stood in front of the photo, in full dress uniform, his medals dull under the solemn lighting. "I carry these stars not just because I led well," he said, "but because he stayed silent when the world didn't deserve his voice." He paused, letting the words settle without orchestration. "I stand because he didn't rise." There were no cameras allowed that day, no media lines, no interviews, but words spread faster than broadcast. Veterans from every branch, every generation, began making their way to the gallery. Some came in wheelchairs, some wore faded jackets. Some walked in alone and stood for hours, not speaking, not needing to. They didn't see themselves in the medals on the walls. They saw themselves in that old man, unmoving, unseen for too long. One retired corpsman knelt in front of the photo and whispered a name. No one heard what he said, but his shoulders shook. A woman in her 70s arrived days later. She carried a small, clear box with a single item inside, an old frayed military cap, its fabric soft with time, the insignia nearly faded. She placed it gently beneath the glass display and spoke to no one in particular. "So he won't sit alone," she said. "This was my husband's." Docents didn't explain the exhibit. They didn't need to. People didn't ask who the man was. They understood. He was every soldier who never asked for a thank you, every veteran who was told to move along, every name lost between wars and promises. The old man had become more than a person. He was a posture, a standard. A boy came with his mother a week later. He stared at the photo for a long time, then tugged her sleeve and asked, "Is he a hero?" She didn't say yes. She knelt beside him and said, "He's someone they forgot, but he never forgot who he was." No speeches, no trumpets, just reverence. Because in that room, the concept of honor was reshaped, not around glory, but around quiet defiance, not through statues of bronze, but through moments of restraint that now bore the weight of history. Keene never visited the gallery again. He said he didn't need to. "It's not for me," he told a friend. "It's for people who need to remember that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's the loudest refusal to disappear." And the photograph remained there, untouched, uncaptioned, powerful in its stillness, because that image did what speeches couldn't. It told the story of a man who had nothing to prove, yet proved everything by staying exactly where he was when the world tried to erase him. The photograph stayed on the wall, untouched, as the country continued to shift around it. It did not need to move because everything else was still catching up. What no tribunal, no camera, no apology could fully articulate, that still image had rendered undeniable. But sometimes real reckoning doesn't come from truth-tellers. Sometimes it comes from those who once looked the other way. It arrived in the form of a column, one written without fanfare but with a title that bled like an open wound across national headlines. "We shot at honor." The byline stunned even more. It belonged to retired Colonel Emory Weller, a white former battalion commander, once considered a career man of the old order. He had led with decorum, precision, and, in the eyes of many, quiet prejudice. Years ago, he'd served alongside Keene's father. He had once vetoed a recommendation for the man's promotion, citing lack of assertive presence. Everyone at the time knew what that meant, but no one said it out loud. In the essay, Weller admitted the truth. Line after line cut through years of silence like a scalpel tracing old scar tissue. "He wasn't too quiet," Weller wrote. "I was too threatened by what that quiet meant. I was taught to salute the noise. He taught by stillness, and I couldn't see it because I was trained not to." The piece didn't read like an apology. It read like a confession, a dismantling. "We didn't shoot at a man," he continued. "We fired at everything we couldn't control. Grace under fire, dignity without demand, leadership without ego." The article detonated through every channel: military forums, mainstream press, and college campuses. It wasn't performative. It was too raw for that. In a rare move, the National Defense Reform Committee requested the piece be read aloud at their next conference. Not summarized, not analyzed, read. And so, in a cavernous hall lined with service ribbons and hushed anticipation, the words were spoken in full. Keene was present, standing near the back. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, as each sentence carved away the facade that had once denied his father a rank, a voice, a recognition earned in blood. But it wasn't Keene the crowd kept glancing at. It was the older man sitting quietly at the far end of the room, dressed in a dark blazer, no medals, no fanfare, just a man in a chair, listening. As the final line was spoken, he led in silence because he didn't need noise to move mountains. The room paused. No applause, just an ache in the air, like something sacred had finally been named. He didn't rise, he didn't wave, but he nodded once, slow, measured, and it was enough. After the session, a young lieutenant approached him. Barely out of the academy, crisp uniform, eyes sharp. He stopped a few feet away, nervous, unsure how to address a man with no title, yet more authority than anyone in the room. "Sir," the young soldier said, voice steady despite his nerves. The old man looked up. For the first time in the long arc of this story, he smiled. Just a fraction, nothing showy, but it cracked the granite of his expression like dawn-breaking stone. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The soldiers saluted anyway, not because of protocol, but because instinct knew who deserved it. Outside, the press waited, but not for him. They waited for quotes from committee members, from strategists, from policymakers, but inside change was happening, not through legislation, but through quiet recognition. Weller's piece was later added to military curricula under a new section titled Institutional Blindness, not as a warning, as a case study. Because it wasn't just about bias, it was about how systems reward mirrors and fear windows. The man they once deemed too quiet had, by staying exactly who he was, forced the system to admit what it had long denied, that character does not require permission to exist, and dignity, when ignored, does not disappear. It becomes the foundation others must now stand on. The ripple left by that quiet nod in the reform chamber had not yet reached the shore, but the world around it had already started to shift. Silence, his trademark, his defiance, his truth, had become louder than banners, medals, or public statements, and when the waves of recognition came crashing toward him, awards, titles, dedications, he stepped aside, unmoved. He declined every proposal, every podium, every offer to place his name in stone. His refusal wasn't bitter, it was absolute, because for him, legacy had never been a destination. It had always been a compass. Instead, he took a pen and a piece of plain paper, no letterhead, no signature, Just 7 handwritten words, tight and sharp, ink pressed with unwavering conviction. He mailed the letter, not to a general, not to a politician, but to the superintendent of the military academy. It read, "Be a man before you become a soldier." That was all. A sentence without decoration, but with more weight than a wall full of plaques. No one expected it, but once it was confirmed, the academy printed the message in bold lettering and mounted it in steel above their main gate. Recruits passed under it daily, backpacks heavy, eyes sharp, boots clean. But something about that sentence stayed with them long after drills and inspections wore off, because it wasn't a command, it was a mirror. Soon after, the academy launched a new leadership program, quiet in title but radical in function. The founder's ethos track. It was modeled on his philosophy, unspoken but unmistakable. The course didn't teach rank, it taught responsibility. It didn't measure reaction time, it measured restraint. It didn't ask how loudly you could speak, it asked how deeply you could carry silence without letting it rot into cowardice. Those who had once dismissed the old man's calm as passivity began to write letters, not to be read, but to be released. Former commanders, old peers, some anonymous, some signed with names long thought too proud to apologize. They wrote not because they were asked, they wrote because shame had nowhere else to go. The letters poured in, each one a quiet monument to a man who had never raised his voice, yet had shattered the spine of a system simply by staying exactly who he was. Keene, seeing what followed in his father's wake, didn't retreat into pride. Instead, he wrote, not a speech, not a biography, but a single essay, a reflection, a reckoning, titled simply, "I was taught by a man who never taught me." The prose was clean, unsentimental, devastating. He spoke of a boy raised by someone who gave no commands but lived them, a father who trained him not to win but to walk away when the victory cost too much. "He taught me not by telling me how to act," Keene wrote, "but by never once showing me how to break." The essay spread through every leadership seminar, printed in training manuals, quoted in eulogies. It was cited not in discussions about tactics, but about character, because by now the message had outgrown the man, and still the man remained exactly as he had been, silent, steady, absent from the noise. A photograph surfaced later that year. It wasn't staged, no flash, no ceremony, just a long lens capture of the old man sitting alone on a bench by a lake. His posture is unchanged, his eyes were fixed on the water, the same cap on his head, worn and weathered, U.S. military barely visible but unmistakably present. That image traveled farther than any parade ever could. People didn't ask where the bench was. They didn't want to disturb it. They wanted it to remain untouched, like his silence, sacred, grounded, and immovable. The image didn't inspire noise, it inspired quiet, the kind that demanded reflection, not reaction. His silence had become a doctrine, not forced, not calculated, pure, elemental, a rejection of vanity, a refusal to be turned into a statue while still breathing. And through that refusal, something far more durable was born, a living legacy, not etched in stone, but carried in thought, in pause, in the space between reaction and understanding. In the end, he didn't need his name on a building, because his sentence was already on the gates of every mind that understood what it meant to hold rank without losing self. He didn't wear a medal, because he had never needed one. He had worn silence like armor, and in doing so, taught a country how to listen. The photograph of the old man at the lake still circulated like a whisper across a nation, no longer interested in noise. It had become a cultural litmus test. Those who understood its gravity needed no explanation. Those who didn't were already irrelevant. In that same stillness, somewhere far from applause and reform, the man with the sun-bleached hair and steel-toed cruelty tried to crawl his way back into the world he once disrespected. The officer who had once pressed his boot onto a veteran's cap, the moment frozen, replayed, reviled, was no longer on any force. Not because of his sentence, which had been light, not because of paperwork, but because his name now lived in the bloodstream of a public that had learned how to recognize shame, and worse, how to remember it. Every application he submitted to departments across state lines was met with the same silence he had once demanded from his victims. Rejection wasn't printed, it was assumed. It wasn't policy that stopped him, it was a memory, the kind that couldn't be scrubbed, couldn't be retrained, couldn't be undone by good behavior or fabricated remorse. His face had appeared in documentaries, not as a subject of interest, but as an emblem of entitlement stripped bare. His name didn't summon authority anymore. It summoned outrage. One department head, in a group chat later leaked to the press, had replied to an internal referral with brutal clarity. "We take him, the community will burn the station to the ground." The message wasn't rhetorical, it was procedural. His existence had become a liability that no amount of policy revision could absorb. And so, with nowhere left to go, he tried to find the one place that couldn't block him with forms or signatures. He went to the source of his disgrace, not the court, not the committee, but the man in the truck. He drove past media vans, past people who recognized him but no longer shouted his name. They didn't need to. He carried it like a weight strapped to his back. He reached the old neighborhood quietly, parked across from the small house with its trimmed hedges and simple porch, and approached the door with a piece of paper in his hand. He knocked once, then again. No response. Inside, the lights were on. He could hear soft movement. Someone was there, but no footsteps came toward the door. No shadow crossed the glass. He waited, and then, knowing the silence wasn't oversight but verdict, he folded the piece of paper and slid it under the door. The words he had scribbled were short, not rehearsed, not elegant, but unmistakably human. "I didn't know who you were, but now I know what I am." The note didn't stay under the door long. A few minutes later, it was pulled back in, not read, not saved, simply torn in half and dropped into a wastebasket. Later that night, when Keene visited his father for dinner, he found the pieces resting on top of coffee grounds and torn receipts. He asked nothing. His father simply looked up and said, "Forgiveness is mine to give. Redemption, that's his to earn." There was no further discussion. None was needed. The world outside might have turned that man into a ghost, but inside this house, judgment didn't need to be cruel, it only needed to be complete. The former officer returned to his car, having heard nothing, received nothing, and been granted nothing. But the silence this time didn't feel passive. It felt deliberate, a wall not of rejection, but of indifference, and in many ways it cut deeper, because now he understood what he had truly lost. Not just reputation, not just a job, but the right to be believed again. The shoes he once wore, the ones polished for intimidation, built for authority, had outlived their purpose. Now they were a symbol, and not the kind carved into monuments. They were a warning, a reminder. The photograph of that boot pressing into faded fabric had done what decades of reports and hearings could not. It had taught a country how to say, "Not anymore." The story's quiet ascent was not televised. It was seared into collective memory. From a lone photograph to a national dialogue, the journey reached its apex with a documentary that didn't shout, but resonated, opening in screens across every military academy and law enforcement training center. The film began not with triumph, but with presence. An elderly man descending from a battered truck, his posture steady, his glance calm, each step deliberate, a counterpoint to the cacophony of power. The title, stark and definitive, "The Man Who Stood in Silence." That sufficiency of silence spoke more than any introduction. There was no flash of medals, no voiceover extolling bravery. Instead, the camera lingered on the worn steering wheel under his fingers, the lines on his face unfiltered by retouching, the midday sun catching the silver in his hair. Each pause was pregnant, each inhale a declaration. As soon as the credits rolled in small theaters, cadets from West Point to the Coast Guard began to stand in hushed tribute, the applause more audible than any trumpet. Weeks later, at the National Film Awards, the documentary earned a nomination. A national honor not for its style, but for its substance. It did not romanticize action. It documented restraint. That recognition didn't just validate the story, it reaffirmed it. Honor isn't bestowed, it's recognized. Meanwhile, at the Springfield Police Academy, the film became mandatory viewing in the first week of recruit training. Fresh-faced cadets, boots crisp and uniforms stiff, crowded into an auditorium that fell still as the man in the truck began his slow descent. No lecture followed, no admonitions, only a new standard quietly embedded into training materials. Not how to fire, but how to weigh silence. Not how to react, but when not to. In a special meeting room overlooking a river, a group of young lieutenants proposed a phrase to be painted on the wall of their strategy room. What would he do? It wasn't rhetorical. It was their internal compass. The silent veteran had become the metric. At a mid-ranking NCO boot camp, a sergeant turned to his class of fresh soldiers and said quietly, "If every dad out there were like him, maybe none of us would need this." The statement rippled through the room. No laughter, no applause, just comprehension settling like dust on newly forged steel. The veteran himself did not attend any screenings or speeches. He had refused every invitation. But at one such event, held just off base in a local theater full of service members and civilians alike, when the final frame of him seated in that truck, engines off, dignity intact, faded to black, the packed audience rose in an instinctive standing ovation. And in that hushed moment, while the applause echoed, someone in the front row spotted General Keene in the back, unmoving. No tears, no waving, just a subtle nod. Quiet, solemn, irrevocable. It was enough. No one dragged the old man onto the stage. No plaques were unveiled in his name, because he had never sought recognition. Instead, his image became the standard against which courage is weighed. His legacy didn't require bronze or ceremony. It stood in every moment of quiet integrity that followed. Years later, when curriculum designers compiled lessons in ethical leadership, they titled one module not after a battle or a battle-hardened hero, but after a silent soldier, measure of a man. It taught accountability through contrast. Action without voice is noise. Silence with substance is power. Leadership is not what you do under fire, it's how you stand when the guns fall silent. The last shot from the documentary hung in institutional lore. The man alone in that weathered truck, not stepping forward, not stepping away, just standing. And through that stillness, he moved an entire nation to redefine what it means to lead, to protect, and to honor. His name may never have been inscribed on a memorial wall, but he became a standard far more enduring, a ruler by which we measure courage, not by what he said, but by every time the world chose to listen. There was no final salute, no farewell banner, no ceremony. After everything he had witnessed, endured, and unknowingly rebuilt, the man who had anchored a national reckoning vanished the same way he had lived, without announcement, without noise, and with a clarity that humbled even the bravest. One morning, long before the sun reached the shutters, he was simply gone. No one saw him leave, no engine startled the neighborhood awake, just a still house, and on the dining table, his cap. Next to it, a piece of paper. The handwriting was tight, clean, and unsentimental. "I leave, so no one else must bow again." When Keene arrived later that afternoon, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something sacred, suspended in the air. He called out once, then twice. No answer. His father's room was untouched, the chair by the window still holding the shape of its last sitter. But in the kitchen, under a slant of light, rested the old military cap, the one that had survived deserts, disgrace, and defiance. He picked up the note, read it once, and didn't say a word, because he understood. This wasn't an escape, it was a transition, the kind only a man like him could make without needing permission. He checked the garage. The truck was missing. Not a different truck, not a replacement. The same dented, rust-bitten machine that had carried his father through war, through judgment, through vindication. It had gone with him, as if it too had waited for the right moment to exit. Keene didn't call the police. He didn't issue a statement. He knew his father wasn't lost, just done. And in a way that felt final, not because of drama, but because it didn't demand to be seen. A week later, someone at a gas station in the neighboring state mentioned an old man with a weathered look and a worn cap asking for directions west. He didn't buy food, he didn't make small talk. He just filled the tank, nodded politely, and drove off into a heat-shimmered horizon. That was the last confirmed sighting. Back in South Hill, the museum had to update its display. Where once there had been photographs and folded documents, now there was something more potent, the cap he left behind. Placed under glass, framed by soft light, it sat not as a relic, but as a quiet expectation. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "He didn't need to speak. We needed to learn to listen." People came, not in crowds, not in pilgrimage, but in pairs, in silence, sometimes alone. Veterans stood longer than most. Recruits took notes. A few mothers touched the glass, whispering something their children couldn't hear. No one lingered out of obligation. They lingered because they had to recalibrate what they thought they knew, and still, no one knew where he had gone. There were rumors, a cabin up north, a coastal town, a farm far inland, but none mattered, because the point wasn't where he went. The point was what he left behind, not in possessions, not in monuments, but in the questions people now ask themselves when faced with power, pride, or injustice. What does silence mean? What does dignity cost? How do you stand when no one's watching? He had never demanded an audience, never raised a banner, and yet, when he left an entire country without equilibrium, forcing it to reweigh how it measured worth, voice, and legacy. And the final image ever taken of him, not staged, not known until later, a highway camera caught the outline of his truck heading west into a spill of evening light. The photograph was blurry. There was no clear view of his face, no timestamp, just motion, just journey, just a man who had said everything without ever needing to raise his voice. He didn't look back. He didn't have to, because everything worth changing was already behind him, and everything ahead was his to carry alone, in peace, exactly as he chose.